Thank you, thank you, thank you. Mark Bowles is my brother-in-law, so he didn't have to work very hard to get me to come here. And now that I'm here, he's going to have to work really, really hard to get me to leave. This is amazing. I've never been on your campus before. I've been to San Diego a number of times and have always understood why people want to live in and around San Diego, but I'd never been on your campus before, and so I'm really good at telling people stuff that they already know. Wow, are you all ever lucky to be here? I'm a creative populist. I am captivated by the idea that each of us and all of us need to be intentionally developing our creatively entrepreneurial qualities. As a creative populist, I intentionally, and that's a word that you're going to hear a bunch of times, this idea of being intentional, I intentionally link these two words together, creative and entrepreneur. I link them together because, in my experience, if the word creativity is floating out there all by itself, most of us think that that means being artistic. And most of us don't think that we can create something of artistic quality, and so most of us say we're not creative. If the word entrepreneur is floating out there all by itself, most of us, most of the time, believe that that means I'm going to start a business. And of course, it does mean that. But most of us don't think we have an idea to start a business, and so therefore we declare we're not entrepreneurial. Well, we just can't afford this. We can't afford these two extraordinary words to be used in such a limiting fashion. So I linked the words creative and entrepreneur together to sort of reboot to give us a fresh opportunity to look at these two words and redefine what these two words can mean. And here's what I'm going to offer that these words mean when linked together. What these words mean when linked together is that we all need to be good at originating ideas. And of course, there's so many techniques for doing that, right? Whether we're originating, whether we're importing ideas through our social capital network, whether we are mashing two ideas together. There's so many ways to originate ideas. We all need to intentionally cultivate the ability to generate fresh approaches to old problems, new ideas, to cultivate emerging opportunities. We all need to be good at that. And then we all need to be good at knowing how to select the best of these ideas, identify the best of these ideas, and then through effective, I used to say efficient execution. I don't know that it's really efficient execution, right? Because if we're doing something new, it's hard to be efficient at it. So maybe it's graceful execution. We all need to be good at taking that new idea and developing its full value through our execution. And while it is likely that many of us are thinking, okay, this is all about building big, new, transformative ideas, it's also a quality that should show up in the inches and the minutes. Imagine if your organization was loaded with creatively entrepreneurial people and they were bringing a creatively entrepreneurial perspective to basic daily organizational life. Well, then yes, you can have a transformative idea that would be a great big victory for your company, for your organization. But if we have 100 victories every day because we're informing the inches and the minutes with a creatively entrepreneurial perspective, a creatively entrepreneurial spirit, then we'll have 100 victories every day, and that can be quite transformative as well. A creative populist, I'm a creative populist, is extraordinarily optimistic about this. I believe that it's just basic human nature is creatively entrepreneurial, and I think there's all kinds of evidence of that. Those of you who have spent any time around your 3 or 4 or 5-year-old son, daughter, niece, or nephew know that the human condition is creatively entrepreneurial. You watch these kids time and again learn through what? Their imaginations, through their extraordinary curiosity. Right? You see all kinds of creatively entrepreneurial behavior, but there's also some hard research if you're the sort of person that wants to see some hard research associated with my proposition to you that the human condition is a creatively entrepreneurial condition, that it's human nature to be creatively entrepreneurial. There was a time in the 60s when NASA was a real important cultural phenomenon in the United States, right? Where they had this big, bold ambition to get to the moon. Well, NASA understood how really important it was going to be for their engineers and their scientists to be very good at a particular sort of creative processing, a particular sort of creative cognition. They call it divergent thinking. I call it divergent discovery. We mean the same thing, and that's the ability to, when faced with a challenge, when faced with a problem, develop a whole lot of solutions for that problem, a whole lot of options for that challenge. Linus Pauling, the only individual to win 2 Nobel Prizes as an individual, said, you want to have a really good idea? Have a lot of ideas, right? So creativity is a numbers game. So divergent discovery is extraordinarily important. NASA was correct to say we need engineers and we need scientists who are really good at divergent discovery. Well, some researchers found out about this assessment tool that NASA developed to evaluate this quality in their prospective engineers and scientists, and they took that assessment tool that NASA had created, they made it age-specific for 5-year-olds, they applied it to 1,500 5-year-olds, this is back in the late 60s, used NASA's grading scale, and discovered that 98% of these 1,500 5-year-old kids scored genius level at divergent thinking. Now, these researchers followed these kids until they were 23 years old, and when they were 23 years old, only 3% of them scored at genius at divergent discovery, and we know why that is, right? They've gone through an educational system that has been telling them there's only one right answer to every problem. I've got it, and you better learn it if you want to pass this class. So we taught them to be less creative in their thinking, but again, evidence that it's basic to human nature to be creatively minded. Another piece of evidence that I've just discovered recently, a journalist has just published a book where he's evaluating the world economy and has concluded that over 50% of all the jobs in the world are self-generated jobs. An individual who's looking within her, because it's very often her in third world nations, or his community, his village, his town, and sees a need and figures out a way to solve that need and earn some income at the same time. So again, it's basic to our human condition to be creatively entrepreneurial. It's a wonderfully optimistic message, it seems to me, and I have a layer of optimism on top of that, and that is that if you're studying what the neuroscientists are beginning to learn about how incredibly plastic our brains are, right? When I was your age, we were told by the scientific establishment that our brains in our early 20s are as good as they're ever going to be. Be careful what you drink or smoke. You can accelerate the deterioration, but it's going to be deteriorating from now on. Well, neuroscientists know that that's no longer true, that your brain is much more like a muscle than we had ever imagined, and therefore, if you use it in a particular fashion, it will get better and better and better at that cognitive processing. So if one were to take the concept of intentionality and determine that you are going to put yourself on a course of cultivating your creatively entrepreneurial qualities, it's going to really happen. Your brain is going to change. It's going to rewire and become a more creative brain. So creative populists are extraordinarily optimistic people. We believe that the economy hasn't recovered, although the stock market yesterday, maybe might have to start to change my story here a little bit, but the economy hasn't recovered because it can't recover. It needs to be renewed. And it will only be renewed when great waves of creatively entrepreneurial talent come washing over all of our organizations in the marketplace and in the public arena as well. One last reason why a creative populist believes that this message is really important and that we need to take it to heart. You know, what I've been saying so far sort of shows up in the marketplace mostly, doesn't it? But back in North Carolina, we just finished a winter that never happened. It never occurred. We were 20 degrees higher than the average every day. Flowers bloomed on the trees 6 weeks earlier than they're supposed to. And regardless of what you think is the cause of all this, it's happening around, you know, there's the challenges that we face in climate change, in energy sources, the challenges that we face are so extraordinary. We're going to have to find the paradigm-shifting solutions for these. And when we do, we need a creatively entrepreneurial citizenry who can, in the wake of these big changes, make appropriate decisions for themselves, for their community, for their families, so they can create advantage from the changes that are going to occur because we need these changes to occur. So I've been teaching at Duke for 10 years. This creative populist, creatively entrepreneurial content has really come together in the last 2 or 3. of those 10 years, I thought at first that I sort of had a lab with my students where I could try out ideas and get their response and the right ideas would emerge. And then I came to understand that that's really what wasn't happening at all. And that's when I began to see this as a populist effort. What I saw that we were doing, my students and I, was that more than experimenting with ideas, we were sort of revealing common ground. We were finding the creative concepts and the creative ideas that we could all stand on together because they are basic, because they're fundamental, because they're populist. And so my mission when I share content behind this recruiting message, I'm recruiting you to the idea that each of us and all of us should be creatively entrepreneurial, is to then bring content that as I share the content with you, mostly you'll be nodding your head saying, oh yeah, I know that. That's familiar. Right? Samuel Johnson, the English literary figure from the 1700s, says man doesn't need to be informed as much as he needs to be reminded. And that's my standard that I use for the populist aspect of this creative content that I'm going to share with you, is that it's so immediately available to you, you'll feel like you've maybe lived with a good part of it already. It's simple. It's not easy, right? Being intentional is not easy. You have to be determined. You have to work at it. But we have created a template of content for people who would like to cultivate their creative abilities. They'd like to develop their entrepreneurial instincts. They want to become more creatively entrepreneurial. We break that content into 3 categories. There's a creatively entrepreneurial attitude. I'm guessing you already know what that attitude is. I've shared it with you 5 times already. It's intentionality. It's to be intentional, right? That's populist. We all have control over our will. Some of us have more control than others, but that's available to all of us to be intentional. We have a creatively entrepreneurial technology. It's nice to have a technology at your hand, right, to extend, to leverage. And if it's going to be a populist technology, it has to be available to all of us, and it has to be easy to use. I think you'll find that we have a creatively entrepreneurial technology that fits that standard. And there's this brand new science that's emerging. Anybody know the science of complexity? Have you been exposed to that yet? We use the word complexity. In the last 25 years or so, there's been a science of complexity that has emerged, and that's what we're claiming as the creatively entrepreneurial science. So the attitude of intentionality, I offer up 4 creatively entrepreneurial behaviors to my students. And I make it real clear to my students that I'm not a guy who makes definitions. I try to provide perspective. My fear is that if you give a student a definition, they learn the definition and are tempted maybe to stop thinking about the meaning behind that concept or that word. So I don't offer tight definitions. I offer sort of loose directions. And so we have 4 creatively entrepreneurial behaviors, and I tell the students, find your own, but here's some good places to start. The first creatively entrepreneurial behavior is to be generous. I started a cellular telephone company and back in the mid-'80s and the early days of cellular, and it was always clear to me that I could never expect the marketplace to be any more generous with us than we are with the marketplace. I could never expect my employees to be more generous with the company than I am with my employees. The example I share with my Duke students that's more relevant to them perhaps because they're not right now in business, most of them, is that what if you practice generosity in the following circumstances? What if when a friend, an associate, a classmate comes to you with that most fragile of all things, a brand new creative idea? What if you resisted the temptation of being able to show off how smart you are and quickly show them all the problems with that brand new idea? Because let's face it, a brand new idea mostly has problems. It's got more holes than it has substance. It's barely teetering when it's a brand new idea. All you have to do is blow on it lightly and you can knock it over. But what if instead you had a generous response? What if you gave them that most precious gift we can give each other these days, which is our undivided attention, and you listen deeply and carefully and authentically as somebody shares that new idea with you, and you take it in, and you really listen to it, and you discipline yourself with intentionality to be as attentive and as careful and as present to the quality of your friend's idea, and yet you want to deeply understand where this idea is coming from. What if that was your generous response when somebody comes to you with a brand new idea? Well, I like to be practical as well as philosophical, and so there's really some very immediate, practical, positive things that occur when you take that generous approach. Number one is you are engaging this plastic brain of yours, and you're learning a new pattern. You're seeing a new business model. You're taking in some new substance, some new content that's going to be there for you later. Later, when you're thinking of your own idea and you're doing your associative creative thinking, there's another pattern that maybe you'll be riffing off of without even being aware that you're riffing off of it. So there's one good thing that happens. Another good thing that can happen is, don't you imagine that if that's what you do first, take in this wonderful or this new idea, that what you will express first will come from that same place, that careful place. And it's more likely that the first questions that you ask, the first comments that you will make, will be the sorts of questions and comments that will help your friend improve her idea. That's a good thing. What if you also become known as the person to go to when others have got great ideas? Don't you want to be in exactly that spot in your organization, the place where people go to say, hey, I got a great idea. What do you think about this idea? Right? That's a great place to be in your organization. That's a good thing. And another good thing that can occur is that maybe your organization starts generating more ideas because your behavior has become contagious and because other people begin to take this generous approach when fresh new ideas are being developed. Now, because you care for your friend and your associate, you finally then do practice some tough love. You don't let them walk away, with a piece of toilet paper on their heel as they're walking away, right? You let them know that there's some problems with this idea, but if you do it at this point, right, after having helped your friend make the best out of this idea, well, then you're critiquing the best version of that idea that you possibly can critique. So one of the behaviors is generosity. Another is humility. I'm going to quote Samuel Johnson twice. No, excuse me, this is from Goethe. Goethe says it's thinking is better than knowing. And in a complex world that we live in, where everything is interrelated and constantly changing, what can you really know? Seems like maybe what you want to say to yourself is that what you know is useful primarily to the extent that it helps you think about what's happening here next, about what is emerging, what's the next challenge, what's the next episode in this world that you're living in. So practicing humility, which Duke seniors aren't very eager to practice humility. But you can be proud and humble at the same time, right? You can be a person who cultivates a sense of humility about yourself and still be very proud of your accomplishments. I see no reason why that would not be so. There's a great story about humility from the English architect Sir Christopher Wren. Some think the greatest British architect of all times. Built St. Paul's Cathedral, which was the tallest building in London for 200 years. Well, he was asked to build a great big guild hall. Sir Christopher Wren was not only an extraordinary architect, but he was a physicist. He was the guy that Isaac Newton used to search out to say, hey, I'm going to bounce some ideas off of you. So he was very broad in his expertise, the sort of person that had every right to see himself arrogantly as the smartest person in the room was Sir Christopher Wren. So he's approached by some folks who want to build the Windsor Guildhall. The Windsor Guildhall is going to be a massive meeting space with lots of internal columns. Lots of internal columns. Because Sir Christopher Wren was a physicist as well as an architect, he was on the cutting edge of load management technologies, and he knew how to build that Guildhall with many fewer internal columns than would have been conventionally proposed. And because suits have this reaction, when Sir Christopher Wren submitted these radical new designs, they were rejected. I'm not going to have the ceiling fall down on my watch. And these suits, the people who were approving the building, the construction, insisted that he use the conventional number of internal columns in the Guildhall. So he built it as requested. He passed away. 100 years go by. It's now necessary to do some internal renovation of this hall. They raise the scaffoldings, and as they raise the scaffoldings, the workmen see that for every column Wren thought was superfluous, there's an inch gap between the top of the pillar and the ceiling. And he went to his deathbed with that secret, right? He's a humble person. He learned what he could learn so he could apply it subsequently, but he didn't stand up on the table 5 years later and say, nah, 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 I told you so. Instead, he was just happy to go to learn what he could learn and to move on to his next project. The third behavior is playful, being playful. And I'll confess that until fairly recently, I knew it needed to be there, but I didn't talk about it very much. I wasn't sure what to say about being playful. And as time goes by, I'm increasingly convinced that being playful is a really, really, really important behavior for us to practice, especially for those of you in this room who are under the age of 30. You haven't played anywhere near enough, boys and girls. Excuse me for saying that to you that way. You haven't played nearly enough. Your parents loved you so much that they had you involved in so many extracurricular activities. And of course, every one of those extracurricular activities all by itself were very useful. But what it meant was you were pushing 50 pounds into a 40-pound sack, and what you didn't have room for was just pure, open-ended, unmediated play. Yes?
I just want to say it's hilarious you bring this up. I just read this blog post this morning. I had no idea you had written it, and I was coming to see you.
Aha.
And so
okay.
You have a comment waiting for me.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. But open-ended play is what? Open-ended play is me picking up a stick and knowing that it feels what? It feels like a sword. And the minute I think that, I feel that, and I see that. And so if it's a sword, then this cloth must be a cape. And as I put that over my shoulder and around my arm, with my next step, I'm a new character, right? And I'm creating narrative. And I'm going out on the playground with this character, with this narrative. But what do I need to do? I need to negotiate my story with the other stories. Sometimes I recruit other stories into my story. I'm building prototypes, right? I've got a prototype here. Oh, I now know that it's time for me to change my narrative, so I break my stick in half. And it's now an eyeglass, and I get to look at the next world that I'm going to populate. That's cultivating so many wonderfully creative and entrepreneurial qualities, and I just wonder where else that comes from if you don't develop that at times of open-ended play. So grab a hold of the concept of generosity and be generous with yourself. Grab a hold of the concept of humility and practice a little bit, because in our culture it does take a little humility to be childlike. And be childlike, right? Develop a sense of play about yourself. And a quick little comment on that is how very, very often my students confuse fun with play. And of course, play is fun, but fun ain't necessarily play, right? When I come to see one of your athletic teams participate in a sport, I can be having a lot of fun watching that, but I'm not involved in play. So play has got this wonderful quality of releasing yourself from yourself, getting rid of the barriers, getting rid of the filters, and you want to practice a sense of play with great regularity. The fourth behavior is to enthusiastically pursue beauty. I keep trying to simplify this content, and it used to just simply be enthusiastic. And at a speaking event where I was talking a while back, somebody raised their hand and said, well, be enthusiastic for what? And the minute that question was asked, I thought, well, I've been looking for a place to put beauty in this template, and I knew immediately. It's to be enthusiastic in your pursuit of beauty. And what do I mean by that? I mean, whatever you believe beauty is has got some really important, there's some important reasons why you want to be present to beauty. One is that I'm looking for somebody's digital device, and I don't see any, but we all know how important it is to refresh our digital devices, right? We know we have to do that. We forget about how important it is to refresh this device, and my sense is that being present, just beholding beauty, has got to be the most refreshing experience for most of us most of the time. And just to be present, not to analyze it, just to enjoy it, to let the sound, to let the color absorb you as you absorb it, just to absorb it. And then yes, as the last chords of that music begin to fade away, you might want to engage in a little analytical consideration as to why was that beautiful? Was it beautiful for some familiar reasons? Let me understand those familiar reasons. Maybe I can understand something about patterns if I examine those familiar reasons. Was it totally a new experience for me? What was it about the new experience that I can learn from? So 4 behaviors to practice intentionally. We also talk about the importance of the intentional use of language. We all know, of course, that our thoughts shape our words. Our words shape our subsequent thinking as well. Not only our subsequent thinking, but of course the thinking of those who hear our words. And so here's a test. Raise your hand if you like being taken advantage of. Nobody? I've had one smartass in the last year and a half raised their hand on this one. I appreciate that nobody here did. So then if we don't like being taken advantage of, why, when we see a new opportunity, do we say we're going to take advantage of that opportunity? Now, I will acknowledge that it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to take the best and leave the rest, but you would call that taking advantage. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to, to manipulate the data that I've got that you don't have so that you see the situation differently than I do to give myself the upper hand. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to do that when I take advantage of an opportunity, but we would call that taking advantage of the opportunity. What if instead we were to say we're going to create advantage from this opportunity? Once again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to nurture it, that you're going to cultivate it, that you're going to recruit some other really great people to work on this thing with you and make sure that everybody's getting the best out of this relationship that we can. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do that, but it points you in that direction, right? It leans you incrementally towards that, that kind of work. And the way to really maybe rivet this point home is to say, if you are a part of a new creative collaborative team, 7 of you are sitting around a table going to work on a new idea. If before you started working you said, what would it be like to take advantage of this opportunity? What would it be like to create advantage from this opportunity? My guess is that it would go a long way towards beginning to orient you towards the most productive, creative time together that you can have. My students will inevitably laugh a little bit when I say you should be intentionally sensual, because of course in America we tend to conflate sensual with sexual, and so we have to spend just a moment making sure that they understand that you can have a wonderful conversation about sensuality without having any sexual connotation to it. But of course it's how we perceive the world is through our senses, right? So the more mindful we are, the more practiced we are, the more determined we are in understanding how our sensual experiences are important to us, and that we practice them, that we engage them. I've got this wonderful mutt, long-haired dog, and time and again, when somebody who's never pet this dog before pets him, he's got the most luxurious fur, and you just watch people, just, they expected it to be sort of a polite pet, and then that's 5 minutes later, they're still petting this dog, and they're just loving the experience of burying their hand in this fur. That's great stuff to do, man. That's great stuff to do. So you need to be cultivating your sensual qualities as well. Whoops. Here's the technology. It's story. It's 50,000 years ago yesterday, the human quality for language emerged. I don't know for sure it was yesterday, but 50,000 years ago, the quality of human language emerged. Let's think about language. Isn't it fun to think about language as the first open source software? And what a wonderfully open source software it is. And oh, by the way, has English emerged as the leading language on this planet because it's the most open source of all the languages, right? We're quite happy to beg, borrow, and steal words from every place we can find them and bring them into the English language. So if language is the first open source software, story is the first killer app. Because we learned the incredible power of story early on. Here's what story could do for us. Before language, before story, our technologies, anthropologists want to call them disposables. Because what we did to that stone, what we did to that stick was so insignificant that it made sense to just dispose of them after we used them, because we could very quickly do that to that stick or do that to that stone the next time we needed it. Right? We just find one on the spot and create that tool again. After story, after language, we have nets, we have baskets, we have clothes, we have complex shelters, right? So the role that story played in that was that story could not only gracefully and effectively be encoded with the directions for how to build a net, but let's face it, if the status quo is so very powerful today, I can't imagine it was any less powerful 50,000 years ago on the human condition. And so why would I build a net? This looks like, I mean, if you just give me the directions for building a net, that sounds like really tough work. Why would I go about stumbling around and doing something I've never done before? Well, story could not only capture the ingredients, the directions, the rules, but the motivation behind why you would want to do this, right? The narrative for why building a net is worth your time. And then we learned as we were becoming more conscious, becoming more aware, we began to aspire. And we learned that nothing is as effective as story at capturing human aspiration and causing us to sort of lean into these stories, grow into these stories of what the best picture of the human condition looks like as captured by our stories. Well, if story could do all that for us, doesn't it stand to reason that we would all become expert storytellers? Right? We would all become expert storytellers, and because we know about the plasticity of the brain, what that means is that for the last 50,000 years, our brains have been shaped by storytelling, which means that when those 7 people sit down to have that creative collaborative session and had the conversation about taking advantage or creating advantage, what if they also talked about what we're doing here as we're building this company, what we're doing here as we're building this product, what we're doing here as we're building this marketing program? Let's create a story. Let's do it as a creative project, as a story, because we all know how to think creatively as storytellers. And so it's most likely that the best creative qualities, the best creative abilities of the people around the table will be most available to each other through the telling of, the creation of a story. I could talk about story itself for hours. Before my email address was Carl@Creative Populist, it was Carl@YourVeryBestStory. So I'm a nut on the power of story. Here's one quick little corollary about the power of story, and that is that taking on the view of yourself as a storyteller means you appreciate you have an audience, right? Well, what a storyteller should know is that the best way to attract an audience is to be attractive to the audience, and the best way to be attractive to the audience isn't to tell the audience your story, but to tell the audience her story, right? She doesn't want to know anything more about what I'm talking about. She'd love to hear a whole lot about what's important to you. I mean, that's the way we are. If I were to be talking about how to get into NYU Law School, I often have Duke students who are trying to get into NYU Law School, so that's my go-to example. If I begin to tell you a story about how to get into NYU Law School, and as I'm telling you that story, I start to get up and leave the room, those of you who want to get to NYU Law School, you're going to get up and you're going to follow me down the hall, right? I'm going to tell you a story that's so much about you that you're going to work as hard as I'm going to work to try to make that story come true. And I've found this to be successful time and again as an entrepreneur. When I can tell the marketplace their story, I can lay down the marketplace narrative, well then the folks in the marketplace narrative want that story that I'm telling them to become true, and they invest themselves in it with me. Complexity, that's the science. These are terms I know that you're hearing about, right? You know the tipping point. Complexity scientists are studying this. They call it phase changes, where they look at a system, an interactive system, and they see that you can add a component and nothing happens. You can add a component and nothing happens. But all of a sudden, when you add that 5th or that 6th component to the system system transforms itself. That's a complexity concept. Increasing returns, right? Classic economists forever said it's a decreasing returns world, a diminishing returns world. Well, it's the complexity scientists who have helped us begin to understand that, well, that may still be very true in the portion of the economy that's, sort of physical economy. In the digital economy, increasing returns are all around you, right? The network effect is the most obvious example of that. And so don't you want to try to harness that? Don't you want to try to study these concepts consciously, because they begin to tune your subconscious mind. You begin to see opportunities to build on an increasing returns dynamic, for instance. Emergence is one of the greatest qualities of complexity. So complexity, we're talking about not complicated, right? A watch is complicated, and if you remove a piece from the watch, it breaks. A system that is complex is adaptive. If you remove a piece of it, New Orleans was a complex system, right? You removed a big hunk of it through the trauma of a flood a few years back, but it didn't stop working. It adapted, it responded, it evolved, and it changed, and it's becoming something else. And what it's becoming when it's becoming something else, a complex system is that's the quality of emergence. And what's really very interesting, what these complexity scientists are learning, is that what you see at the micro level, right, the individual pieces that are forming relationships with each other and are causing these new systems, these new patterns, these new forms to emerge, that what happens at the macro level often has nothing to do with happening at the micro level. The classic example that people use is that a molecule of H2O isn't wet. Wetness is a quality that emerges when a number of these units form a relationship, are in relationship with each other. An individual termite doesn't, you can't look at an individual termite and predict these 10-foot mounds with complicated engineering that in 120-degree savanna temperatures can still keep the nest of eggs cool, so that they'll hatch at 82 degrees, right? You can't predict that incredibly complex system is going to emerge from this individual unit. So this quality of emergence is so important, and that emergence occurs from bottoms up self-organization. These individual units have got some simple rules. They organize themselves around these simple rules, and these complex systems emerge. A picture of that is a Midwest farm boy that I am. Time and again, you would drive down a country road right after the corn has been harvested, and 500 blackbirds take to the sky, right? You've all seen that in one form or another. And they engage in these incredibly artistic aerial ballets. And as a kid, I used to wonder, well, where's the brain on that? Who's organizing this? What's the system that they're all, that's got them in this wonderful coordinated activity so that they're not crashing into each other and they're making their way across the road to another field? Well, there's just a couple of really very simple rules that if each bird follows these couple of very simple rules, and in this particular instance, these are spatial rules. I'll stay X distance from the bird in front of me. I'll stay Y distance from the bird next to me. And as long as those simple rules are followed, well, then a wind change can occur, and these 2 or 3 birds that are most buffeted by the wind change will respond to the wind change, and all the birds around them will respond as well by following these basic, simple rules of complexity. It's a cool science. If you're interested in it at all, the Santa Fe Institute is where you'll find a lot of really good thinking about the science of complexity. And so we're going to do a little exercise here. Did we get the handouts? We're going to do an exercise around this idea that I've shared with you really briefly before. This is that quality that 5-year-olds are 98% geniuses at, this divergent discovery. I call it divergent discovery rather than divergent thinking for a couple of reasons. One of which is it is a discovery process, right? That's the kind of thinking that you want to be doing. You want to be doing discovery. And it's not just thinking, it's also sometimes really very active. So we're in, I call it divergent discovery partly for that reason, but also I just like the alliteration. And it's convergent thinking is more alliteration, right? Convergent creation. So I've got a lot of ideas and I'm beginning to distill them, I'm beginning to play with them, I'm beginning to learn my ideas better, and I'm bringing the best down to, converging down to the idea that I really want. Is it for every person? Yeah, it's one for each person. Yes, one for each person. So a couple of sort of tips about how to improve your divergent discovery. Here's a couple of tips. One is that is so well named by a lady named Rosabeth Moss-Cantner. Rosabeth Moss-Cantner is a professor at Harvard, and she has this idea that she calls kaleidoscopic thinking. Right? Do I need to say anything else about kaleidoscopic thinking? Right? When you've got all these ideas in your top of your divergent discovery funnel, keep turning the dial on them, right? It's the relationship between the ideas where the value is usually found. It's the relationship between the ideas where the new opportunity is found, right? So you keep playing with the relationships between these ideas that you are divergently discovering as you would turn the dial on a kaleidoscope, and you keep seeing fresh relationships between the ideas each time you turn it. And if I tell you to be playful as one of your behaviors, this process is a great place to practice being playful, right? Because you're not in any hurry to find the right idea. You're going to take some time to locate the best idea. So that's one aspect of, or one idea about how to improve your divergent, discovery thinking. Another is I don't go out a lot to cocktail parties, but what I do, and somebody asks me what I do, I can't wait for somebody to ask me what I do, because I'll say in a voice louder than I need, I'll say, oh, me, I teach Duke students to be deviants. And those of you who know the old E.F. Hutton campaign know that I get an E.F. Hutton moment, right? The whole room goes quiet. They want to know what the heck Norgan's talking about, that he teaches Duke students to be deviants. And then I go on to talk about some sociological research that we base our exploration of being the deviant upon, which says, you know, you want to see the mainstream differently than others. You just have to. You know, the way to get a creative idea is to see the world differently. So another great place to be humble, another great place to be playful, because you're going to be the deviant very often when you're being playful. You're going to be the deviant very often when you're being humble during a creatively entrepreneurial process. There's other ways to practice being creatively a deviant as well. You can be a contrarian, right? My advice to you, if you want to be a contrarian working in this process, is treat being a contrarian like you would a chainsaw. It's absolutely the right tool when you need it, but you don't want to carry it around with you any more often than you need to, right? I mean, generally being the contrarian doesn't strike me as a very creative position to take, but that's another way to practice or to engage in divergent discovery. I'm going to tell you one last real quick story that I think does a wonderful job of capturing what goes on as you're going from your top of your funnel with all of your great ideas, and you're distilling them, you're playing with them, you're bringing them down to that which you really want to do, and how often it happens that you come down to two ideas that you've loved in the early stages, but now you're realizing they're kind of in conflict with each other. They kind of contradict each other a little bit. And so our natural inclination so very often, of course, is to compromise. I would suggest rather than compromise, you explore the power of both. And here's where I learned the power of both, and then we'll get into the exercise. I was driving home early one morning, and I looked up the road, and it was a little country road with swampy lowland woods on both sides of the road. And I looked up the road, and there were two shapes lurching across the road in a locomotion that I hadn't really ever seen before, and they were small. And I pulled my truck off the side of the road, ran up there, and there was two, I say day-old, I think they could have been day-old baby snapping turtles. And as I picked them up, one of them totally disappeared inside her shell. The other one stuck out his neck as long as he could and opened up his mouth as wide as he could and, you know, threatened me. And if you've seen a 30 or 40-pound snapping turtle, you know, they can be menacing, so this was sort of a miniature menace of a snapping turtle. And so I put him in my truck, and I knew that there was a place down the road where I could go where there would be a path, and I could follow the path to a creek side about a mile off the highway. And I'm sort of a free willy kind of a guy, right? I'm going to make sure that these snapping turtles don't become roadkill. So I walked down the path. I put the turtles just inside the water, you know, just on the water side of the shore, and in an instant they both disappeared. In an instant they both disappeared. One burrowed into the soft mud, and one darted into the deep water. And I thought, oh my gosh, regardless of what predator was after them, one of them would have survived. And so I thought, well, this is contrary behavior, but if you're asking the right question, it ain't contrary behavior at all, right? It's really very graceful and appropriate behavior. So as you're engaged in your divergent discovery and you're bringing your ideas down to a convergent moment where you're going to find the best idea, and you do find that you're in conflict between two ideas, before you compromise, before you reject one of the ideas, reconsider the question that you're asking, right? There's some reason why you like these two ideas. Reconsider the question that you're asking. Restate the strategy that you're working on so that maybe you can unlock the power of both of these ideas rather than compromising one away. So the one that I want to work on today, or with you right now, is the coffee cup and the apple. And so here's what I would like you to do with this exercise. I would like you to spend a couple of minutes, flip it over or use whichever side of the page you want, and I want you to come up with as many individual objects as you can think of that belong on that page with these two objects, that complete it, that extend it, that enhance it, whatever however you want to think about this. Identify the third object, and again, you want a good idea, have lots of ideas, right? So come up with lots of third objects that might fit on that page. And I'll give you a couple of minutes, and then I'll take you through some other. Look at the items that you listed, and do those items give you evidence that you were thinking about this exercise in a particular way? Was there a theme to these items, right? And were you aware of it? Or do these items say to you, oh my gosh, I was thinking about the following. I didn't know that I was thinking about the following as I was listing my third object until I now see the objects, right? So for instance, I know that Duke students more than once have said, oh, I didn't realize I was thinking about breakfast until I saw the other objects that I listed. So there's an example of a theme that might emerge for you as you examine your list of items. If there is a theme that has emerged for you as you examine these, now consciously apply that theme. Now that you know you were thinking about breakfast, does it give you another set of objects that you think belong on the list, right? Make sense? Here's another thing that you would want to do with your list as you're working on a real-world divergent discovery challenge, and that is that you might want to now take any two of the objects on your list and find the third object that belongs with those, right? That's another thing that one could do to continue to build as many solutions, as many choices as you can come up with. After you've done a couple of things like that, again, determine if there's a theme that you were either aware of or weren't aware of, and now that you're highly aware of it, does it give you other options to choose from? Or after you pair up some of your objects, does it give you more choices to choose from? There's a couple things that one can do engaged in divergent discovery. Now that you've done that, then I would suggest that, and this is sort of truncating this a little bit, that you would then look at that list, and is there one object that just is insistent? It's just saying to you, I'm the one that belongs there, right? Your eye keeps going back to it as the thing that you ought to select, and then draw that third item. And as you're drawing that third item, I'll share another little creatively entrepreneurial, creative populist tip, and that is that I've been teaching at Duke for 10 years. For the first 8 years, I was a hypocrite. I would say to my students, usually in a typical semester 4 or 5 times, it would come up in the context of something that was going on in the classroom. I'd say to them, well, you know, I'm just not a very good visual thinker. And I can't believe it took me 8 years to hear that I'm urging them to transform the way that they think about things creatively, and here I am quite comfortable to say, oh, I'm not a very good visual thinker. So in the last couple of years, I've been trying to bring in a lot of visual exercise into the classes because it's inevitable, right? What I had been telling my students is to have an idea in your head is one thing, but you have to understand it very differently to be able to then write it down, right? So that's a good thing, right? Now I have 2 perspectives on my idea. Well, now I understand that after I've thought about the idea, after I've captured it in sort of a text or narrative form, now I want to draw it. Now I want to render it. Now I want to graph it. Now I want to illustrate it. Now I want to do some visual thinking around that idea because, once again, I will have to understand that idea differently, or I will come to understand that idea differently if I now try to represent it in some visual fashion. So we have a lot of exercises in the last couple of years with my students where because they'll all raise their hand and say, well, I can't draw. And I said, okay, one of 2 choices. Either none of us can draw, or we all can draw. You guys choose. And now let's not have that conversation anymore. So you could now draw the third object. Or let's not do that. Let's move to the other exercise, which is a more pure drawing exercise. So the other is this incomplete shape. Thank you very much, Shane. So it's this item. Everybody got one of these? So there is a creative intelligence test called the Torrance test. Anybody know the Torrance test? 1 or 2 people know the Torrance test. It began in the 60s. It's now a massive study. You can argue about the specifics of what they do in their measurement of creativity, but it's this massive database. It's clearly seen now as the gold standard of measuring creativity. This is a piece of the Torrance test that you'll be taking here. And so what you want to do is, with that as your starting point, draw something. Draw an image. All right, we got a peacock. Got a peacock. You can see, you can see where, right? That's awesome, peacock. What else we got? A TV. Oh yeah, with rabbit ears. Y'all are too young to know about rabbit ears, man. Yes.
Use it as a tool you can grab sushi. So it's a chopstick trainer.
Hold it up so we can see it, man. All right. It's chopstick trainer. Yes. All right. Eating whatever those things are called. Either way, very cool, very, very cool. And I saw that one. There's a hand gripper.
Yeah.
A hand gripper, that's cool. Yeah. Whoa. Crocodile, or is it an alligator? I'm not sure. Very cool. So here's how Torrance would evaluate this. They would look for originality, and they have like 500,000 entries in their database, so they can, in fact, do a statistical analysis for originality. That's hard to measure, right? But they now have a big enough database that they can measure originality. A second is generosity, in fact. Have you filled the page? You know, have you just, has your expression been generous and you just sort of took over the whole space? Right? Not all of these are important, right? You could score high on this without necessarily being generous because the third idea is narrative. Was there a story that you began to suggest or tell in your image? And then a fourth way that they evaluate this is how much detail is there in your image. Here's one thing that's that's a little, one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this topic, one of the reasons why I'm becoming urgent about us collectively in a populist fashion embracing the importance of all of us being creatively entrepreneurial, is that while all other intelligence tests, you all know the Flynn effect, right? Flynn, a few decades back, realized that all intelligence tests increase their average score every decade. In 1990, the Torrance test scores started ratcheting down, and they've been ratcheting down ever since, and it's about the time a generation of kids no longer were actively engaged in open-ended play. That's the theory that many would propose as to why the Torrance scores are beginning to ratchet down here a little bit. So we got about 15 minutes or so, plus or minus, right? And I thought that we would conclude by hopefully there being some good discussion amongst you. Are there any of these ideas that you'd like to hear more about? Do you all have your own contributions? I mean, what I try to do with this template of content is appreciate the following. And that is that, Western culture has been wrong. I'm not sure about Eastern culture, but Western culture has been wrong for a few centuries now to have the idea that creativity was this special gift of a privileged few. I really think it's as common as can be. It's as common as dirt, and all the more wonderful because of it. But we're also very creative in our own fashion, in our own unique way. It's very much tied to our individual personalities, how we express our creativity, how we develop our creativity. So I want the Creative Populist template to be very, very flexible as a starting point for people to build their own idea of themselves as a creatively entrepreneurial person. So I'm quite confident that in a room of these, with you all in it, that there are many creative people here who've got their own ideas about how you cultivate and develop your creative abilities. So I'd love to hear those ideas. I'd love to, again, to hear any questions.